Sweat froze to Caleb's eyelashes before it could even drip. Snorts, he was supposed to be dead, at least according to the blinking red light on his heavy training harness. When the plasma rained down from the pale morning sky, shattering the mess hall into a crater of screaming, melting metal, nobody thought it was an alien invasion. They just thought the instructors were getting creative. By the time the invaders realized they hadn't hit a defenseless backwater mining colony, they were already bleeding out in the freezing mud. Bile burned the back of Caleb's throat, acidic and warm, fighting a losing battle against the sub-zero air scraping its way into his lungs. He spat, watching the yellowish fluid sink into the gray, semi-frozen mud of Outpost 9. His knees shook, not from fear, but from a profound cellular exhaustion that made his skeleton feel like it was vibrating. 72 hours without sleep. 72 snorts hours of marching under simulated artillery fire, carrying an 80 lb pack loaded with dead weight, breathing air that smelled of ozone and powdered rust. Earth's elite didn't train in sterile, gleaming facilities. They trained in the armpit of the galaxy, on a barren rock where the atmosphere was just thick enough to keep you alive and just toxic enough to give you a constant, pulsing migraine. Caleb leaned his forehead against the rusted, corrugated steel of the barracks wall. The metal bit into his skin, a sharp, grounding pain. He closed his eyes. Next to him, Becker was sliding down the wall, his chest heaving in jagged, uneven gasps. Becker's face was smeared with carbon scoring from a near-miss stun grenade, his lips cracked and bleeding sluggishly. "If Chief calls another drop drill," Becker wheezed, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together. "I'm going to shove my rifle barrel down my own throat." Caleb didn't laugh. He couldn't muster the oxygen for it. His uniform stiff with dried sweat and frozen mud chafed raw circles into his armpits and groin. Every joint was a rusty hinge. This was the crucible. The final week of the Vanguard qualification. Only 20% of the recruits made it this far, and the instructors were doing their absolute best to weed out the rest by simply breaking them in half. The air smelled strictly of misery. Unwashed bodies, cheap synthetic nutrient paste that tasted like heavily salted cardboard, and the metallic tang of the environmental scrubbers working overtime. Caleb unclipped his helmet, letting it drop into the sludge with a dull thud. His scalp prickled as the frigid wind hit his sweat-matted hair. "Just breathe, man," Caleb said. His own voice sounded hollow, detached. "2 more days, just 2 more days, and we get a hot shower." "I'd kill a man for a hot shower. I'd kill a man for a lukewarm puddle," Becker muttered, letting his head loll against his shoulder. A high-pitched whine began to build in the distance. It wasn't the usual throaty roar of the instructor's drop ships. It was thinner, sharper. It sounded like a massive drill bit biting into glass. Caleb opened one eye, his cynical brain already calculating how fast he needed to snap his helmet back on. The instructors loved ambush tactics. The sky above Outpost 9 was perpetually overcast, a bruised purple canopy of thick methane clouds. Through that bruising, violent streaks of searing blue light suddenly tore downward. Caleb frowned. The simulated plasma rounds were usually orange. A localized thermal burst that scorched armor but didn't vaporize anything. This blue light was blinding. It cast harsh, unnatural shadows across the mud pit. A drop pod slammed into the earth 300 yards away. The impact didn't sound like a heavy thud. It sounded like the world cracking open. A shockwave of displaced air and liquefied mud hit Caleb a second later, knocking him off his feet. He hit the ground hard, tasting iron as his teeth clamped down on his tongue. Before he could push himself up, the mess hall, a sprawling dome of reinforced concrete where the B squad was currently eating, simply ceased to exist. There was no explosion, not in the traditional sense. Just a terrifying concussive womb that sucked the oxygen from the air, followed by a blinding flash. When Caleb blinked the afterimages from his retinas, the dome was gone. In its place was a glowing, white-hot crater. Liquid concrete bubbled at the edges. The smell hit him next. It wasn't ozone or simulated powder. It was roasting meat, charred hair, vaporized blood. Caleb lay in the mud, his brain misfiring. The instructor screwed up. The targeting AI glitched. That was the only logical explanation. The military had just accidentally killed 40 of its own recruits. He scrambled to his knees, his hands slipping in the half-frozen slush. Sirens finally began to wail, a panic staccato blare that lacked the rhythmic cadence of a training alarm. "Becker," Caleb yelled, spitting blood from his bitten tongue. "Becker, get up." Becker was staring at the Owing crater, his mouth hanging open. The exhaustion that had been crushing him a moment ago was wiped clean, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed shock. They used live ordnance. Why did they use live ordnance? More blue streaks tore through the clouds. 4-8-12. They hammered into the perimeter fence, turning the automated defense turrets into slag. The Snort's ground heaved like a ship at sea. Caleb grabbed his rifle from the muck. The weapon felt incredibly heavy, a dead lump of metal locked in simulation mode. He jammed his thumb against the safety release, his hands trembling violently. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, finally pierced through the fog of his exhaustion. A shadow fell over them. Through the drifting acrid smoke of the vaporized mess hall, a shape emerged from the primary drop pod. It was tall, too tall, with joints that bent at odd insectoid angles. It carried a weapon that hummed with that same glass-shattering frequency. Caleb stared at the figure. The utter absurdity of the situation wrestled with his survival instinct. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't a training accident. He didn't feel heroic. He didn't feel a surge of righteous fury. He just felt an overwhelming, deeply cynical annoyance. He was exhausted. He was freezing. His squad mates were burning. And now he had to deal with this. Rain began to fall, turning the ash in the air into a greasy gray paste that coated everything. Caleb watched the alien step fully out of the smoke. Its armor was pristine, a seamless integration of dark, iridescent metal that repelled the mud like oil on water. It moved with an arrogant, fluid grace. It didn't belong here. It was a creature designed for clean, precise warfare, stepping Snorts into a localized hell created explicitly to breed human monsters. The alien swept its weapon across the courtyard. A beam of blue light severed the communication mast, bringing 30 tons of steel crashing down into the motor pool. Beside Caleb, Becker finally snapped out of his trance. The terrified recruit vanished, replaced by the cornered animal the Vanguard instructors had spent 6 months cultivating. Becker didn't scream. He didn't issue a battle cry. He just let out a low guttural grunt and racked the bolt of his rifle. Sim locks, Caleb hissed, his voice tight. The guns are locked out. Every weapon on the outpost was electronically restricted to fire dummy rounds and blank charges to prevent friendly fire during the brutal drills. The biometric safeties required a master override from Command to accept live ammunition. Command currently was a pile of glowing ash where the primary administrative bunker used to be. The alien turned its narrow, faceless helmet toward their position. It had heard them. Panic flared in Caleb's chest, a hot, bright spike of genuine terror. He dropped to his stomach as a bolt of plasma sizzled through the air exactly where his head had been. The heat radiating off the beam blistered the back of his neck. The mud beside him boiled instantly, bursting into a cloud of scalding steam. "Override the mag well," Becker yelled, already jamming a multi-tool into the side of his rifle. He was panting, sweat-cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "Break the retaining pin." It was a court-martial offense to tamper with the weapon locks. Caleb almost laughed at the thought. He slammed his rifle against the concrete foundation of the barracks, hitting the precise spot above the magazine release. Once, twice, on the third strike, the cheap synthetic casing cracked. He dug his thick mud-caked fingers into the fracture, ignoring the sharp plastic edges slicing into his cuticles, and ripped the electronic governor out. Sparks spat against his glove. He shoved a magazine of live armor-piercing rounds into the well. It clicked with a heavy, satisfying finality. The alien was advancing. It didn't bother using cover. Why would it? As far as its sensors probably told it, this was a remote resource extraction facility. A soft target, unarmed miners, easy prey. Caleb popped up over the concrete lip, resting the barrel of his rifle on the edge. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. His breath came in ragged, shallow pulls. He wasn't aiming for center mass. The iridescent armor looked thickest there. He aimed for the strange, articulated joint at what passed for the creature's knee. He pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into his bruised shoulder, a brutal physical reminder that the simulation was over. The gunshot was deafening, a raw mechanical roar that cut through the alien's high-tech whine. The armor-piercing round hit the joint. It didn't penetrate cleanly. It shattered the armor plating, sending a spray of dark, viscous fluid, almost black in the dim light, erupting into the rain. The alien shrieked. It wasn't a roar. It was a metallic, synthesized scream of absolute, unadulterated shock. It staggered, its flawless balance instantly destroyed, and collapsed into the Ezzing mud, the pristine armor was instantly fouled by the muck. "They bleed," Becker whispered. He laughed, a short, ugly sound entirely devoid of humor. "The bastards actually bleed." More pods were opening. Sleek, angular figures poured out, their weapons glowing with lethal intent. They moved in formation, expecting to mop up civilians cowering in hab blocks. Instead, they were walking into a meat grinder. From across the compound, the staccato rhythm of live gunfire began to echo. Other recruits had figured out how to break the sim locks. These were men and women who had been starved, beaten, sleep-deprived, and pushed to the absolute brink of human sanity for half a year. They had nothing left in their emotional reservoirs but aggression and survival instinct. Caleb watched as 3 aliens breached a trench line to the east, expecting empty fortifications. A massive human figure, Cole, from a squad, surged out of the muddy water. Cole didn't even have a functioning rifle. He had an entrenching tool. He swung the sharpened steel shovel like an axe, burying it deep into the neck joint of the lead alien. The creature convulsed, spraying that thick black blood over Cole's face. Cole just wrenched the shovel free and turned on the next one, his teeth bared in a feral grimace. The aliens halted. Their tight, arrogant formations broke. Confusion was palpable even across the distance. They fired wildly, but the recruits were already moving, slipping through the trenches and ruined buildings like ghosts in the mud. Snorts, they knew every blind spot, every firing angle of this miserable rock. It was their home. Caleb racked another round into the chamber. His hands had stopped shaking. The headache was gone, replaced by a hyper-focused, terrifying clarity. The Snort's exhaustion was still there, a heavy blanket over his muscles, but the adrenaline held it at bay. "Flank right," Caleb grunted, spitting mud from his lips. He looked at Becker. "We hit them from the motor pool wreckage." Becker nodded, his eyes wide, pupils dilated to pinpricks. "They picked the wrong damn planet." Caleb scrambled over the concrete barrier, his boots slipping, his lungs burning. He wasn't fighting for Earth or for humanity or for glory. He was fighting because these alien bastards had ruined his one chance at a hot shower, and he was too angry to die. Diesel fuel pooled across the cratered Earth, bleeding a rainbow sheen into the gray slush. The pulverized remains of the motor pool smelled like a massive, catastrophic oil lake mixed with the unmistakable copper tang of fresh blood. Caleb crawled on his belly beneath the twisted, smoking chassis of a heavy troop transport. The ground here was a freezing soup of mud and shattered safety glass that bit right through his reinforced uniform, slicing angry little lines into his forearms. He didn't care. The pain was just a reminder that he wasn't vaporized. 10 YD ahead, 2 of the alien soldiers were advancing through the wreckage. Close up, their armor was even more maddeningly perfect. Its snorts didn't just deflect the rain, it seemed to repel the very concept of grime. Snorts, their helmets swept back in a sleek, eyeless wedge, and the weapons snorts they carried hummed with a suppressed, violent energy that made Caleb's fillings ache. They moved with algorithmic precision, covering each other's blind spots perfectly, except they were looking for heat signatures. They were looking for structural strongholds. They were fundamentally unprepared for a human being perfectly willing to submerge himself entirely in sub-zero toxic sludge just to get a better angle. Caleb pressed his cheek into the oily muck, tasting diesel. Beside him, pinned behind a blown-out tire, Becker was shivering so violently his rifle barrel rattled against the rubber. "We can't take 2, Becker mouthed, his eyes wide and feverish in the dim light. "They have shields. I saw it on the ridge, energy ripples. Our rounds just bounce off." Caleb watched the nearest invader step gracefully over a severed exhaust pipe. The creature was scanning the burning ruins of the administration block. Becker was right. Standard tactical doctrine against shielded infantry required sustained, coordinated fire to overwhelm the energy threshold. They didn't have that. They had 2 battered rifles and magazines full of lead and spite, but Caleb also remembered basic physics. Energy shields dispersed thermal and kinetic impact, but they couldn't negate mass. He looked up. Directly above the aliens, the scorched skeleton of a transport crane groaned in the wind. Suspended by a single fraying steel cable was a 6-ton depleted uranium engine block, half pulled from a transport vehicle before the attack began. The winch control box hung by its wires right above Caleb's head, sparking weakly. Caleb didn't form a master plan. His exhausted brain just drew a straight, brutal line from point A to point B. He rolled onto his beat. Axe sinking deeper into the freezing water. The mud filled his ears, deadening the hum of the alien weapons. He raised his rifle, ignoring the screaming protest of his shoulder muscles, and aimed not at the aliens but at the sparking control box above him. "Cover your ears," Caleb whispered. He pulled the trigger, the rifle bucked. The first shot missed, sparking off the crane's gantry. The second shattered the plastic casing of the control box. Instantly, the winch brakes failed. The terrible shriek of unspooling steel wire cut through the rain. The alien directly beneath the crane snapped its wedge-shaped head upward, its internal sensors suddenly registering the 6 tons of dead weight falling from the sky. Its personal shield flared, a brilliant, blinding sphere of hard light geometry projecting outward to protect its master. The engine block hit the shield. The energy field held for a microsecond, glowing brighter than the sun before the sheer unyielding kinetic reality of Earth gravity and heavy metal simply crushed the creature beneath it. There was a sickening crunch, wet and heavy, followed by an abrupt sputtering pop as the shield generator overloaded and detonated. The shockwave threw the second alien sideways, sending it crashing into a pile of razor wire barricades. Its pristine armor scraped and shrieked against the rusted steel barbs. "Move." Caleb roared, spitting diesel-flavored water. He scrambled out from under the transport, his boots slipping, his lungs burning as if he were inhaling crushed glass. The surviving alien was thrashing in the razor wire, its energy shield flickering erratically. It raised its humming rifle, aiming blindly. A bolt of blue plasma seared the air inches from Caleb's face. The heat was instantaneous, instantly crisping his eyebrows and blistering the skin of his left cheek. The stench of his own burning hair filled his nostrils. He stumbled, falling hard onto his knees on the jagged concrete, but he didn't stop moving. Becker was already there. With a guttural feral scream, Becker didn't shoot. He drove the heavy reinforced composite stock of his rifle directly into the flickering energy shield. The impact threw Becker back, dislocating his shoulder with a wet pop, but it forced the alien shield generator into a fatal reset. The geometric light vanished. Caleb leveled his rifle point blank. He squeezed the trigger until the magazine clicked empty. Deafening echoes chased each other through the wreckage. The alien stopped moving, its chest plate shattered into a dozen iridescent shards. The black viscous fluid leaked out, pooling into the mud, mixing with the diesel and the rain. Caleb collapsed onto his side, his breath tearing in and out of his throat in wet rags. His cheek was in agony where the plasma had grazed him. Looked at Becker, who was curled into a ball, clutching his arm and weeping quietly, not from sadness but from the sheer overwhelming release of tension and pain. "We killed them," Becker sobbed, a hysterical edge to his voice. "We actually killed them. Don't get comfortable," Caleb wheezed, his eyes tracking the sky. Through the bruised methane clouds, more blue streaks were descending, dozens of them. "They're just figuring out we bite back." Breathing became a conscious, mechanical effort. In, count to 2. Out, count to 2. If Caleb stopped focusing on the rhythm of his own lungs, he was certain he would simply stop existing. The rain had turned into a sleet storm, tiny daggers of ice that felt like sandpaper against his blistered face. He dragged Becker by the webbing of his tactical harness, slipping and sliding through the communication trench that led to Bunker 4. The trench walls were reinforced with plastisteel, but the mud at the bottom was knee-deep. Every step required yanking his boot out of a freezing vacuum. "Leave me," Becker mumbled, his head lolling. The shock of his dislocated shoulder, combined with 72 hours of sleep deprivation, was dragging him into a dangerous lethargy. "I'm going to slow you down, just leave me here, it's warm in the mud." "Shut up," Caleb rasped, his grip slipping on the wet nylon. "If I leave you here, Chief Miller is going to revive you just to court-martial you for malingering. Keep your feet moving." They rounded a sharp dogleg in the trench. The heavy blast door of Bunker 4 was ahead. It was sealed tight. The locking mechanism engaged, but what made Caleb's heart drop into his stomach was the deep molten gouge carved into the center of the reinforced steel. The aliens had been here. They had tried to cut their way in, failed, and moved on. Caleb slammed his fist against the intercom panel. It sparked. Dead, he hammered the butt of his rifle against the steel door. "Open up." "It's Caleb and Becker, Squad B, silence." Just the wind howling over the lip of the trench and the distant rhythmic thud of plasma artillery turning the northern perimeter into glass. "They're all dead," Becker whispered, slid down the corrugated wall into the icy sludge. "Command is gone, we're just waiting our turn." Caleb leaned his forehead against the cold steel of the blast door. A profound hollow despair threatened to swallow him. He was 22 years old. He had signed up for the Vanguard to escape the suffocating poverty of the orbital rust belts, trading one miserable existence for another under the promise of a pension. He didn't want to die in a ditch on a nameless rock. Suddenly, the heavy locking bolts inside the door clanked. The massive steel slab groaned, grinding against its frame, and slid open just enough to reveal darkness. A hand shot out. A hand wearing a scorched, bloody tactical glove grabbed Caleb by the tactical harness and hauled him inside with terrifying strength. Becker was dragged in a second later. The door slammed shut, plunging them into the suffocating darkness of the bunker. The air inside was foul, thick with the smell of sweat, cordite, and the sharp, coppery scent of fresh blood. A red emergency light flickered on. Standing before them, leaning heavily against a weapon rack, was Chief Instructor Miller. The right side of Miller's face was badly burned, the flesh angry and weeping, and his right arm ended in a cauterized stump just below the elbow. He was applying a compression bandage with his teeth and his remaining hand. He didn't look heroic. He looked like a cornered. "You're late, recruits," Miller grunted, spitting out the plastic wrapper of the bandage. His voice was a gravelly rasp, unchanged by the fact he was missing a limb. "Chief," Caleb breathed, stumbling backward. The adrenaline was draining out of him, leaving him hollow. They hit the mess hall. "Command is gone." "I know. I was in the secondary comms array when they leveled it." Miller limped over to a heavy munitions crate and kicked the lid open. "I managed to rip the biometric safeties off this batch of ordnance before the network collapsed. Grab heavy." Caleb stared at the crate. It was packed with armor-piercing belts, high-explosive grenades, and 2 heavy rotary cannons. It was the kind of gear they were supposed to earn after graduation. "What are they?" Caleb asked, his voice cracking. "Who the hell is attacking us?" Miller picked up a grenade, testing its weight in his remaining hand. His one good eye was cold and utterly devoid of fear. "I don't know and I don't care, but they made a tactical error. They wiped out the entire administrative chain in 5 minutes. Becker whimpered from the floor, clutching his shoulder. "Exactly," Miller sneered, a bloody smile pulling at the unburned side of his mouth. "They hit the soft targets. They think they knocked out the brain so the body will die. They think this is a standard military installation." Miller walked over to Becker, knelt down, and without a word of warning grabbed Becker's arm and violently wrenched it upward. A sickening pop echoed in the bunker, followed by Becker's agonizing scream. "Walk it off," Miller growled, pulling Becker to his feet. "They think they're fighting soldiers who need orders. They don't realize what this place is. This isn't a barracks, it's a kennel, and they just broke the leash." A terrible vibrating hum resonated through the steel floor. Dust rained down from the concrete ceiling. "They're setting up a localized jamming field over the primary comms dish," Miller said, tossing a rotary cannon to Caleb. The weapon weighed 40 lb. Caleb nearly buckled under it, his exhausted muscles screaming. "If they get that dish, they'll scrub this sector from the grid and call in their main fleet. We die quietly in the dark, so we blow the dish," Caleb asked, his cynical mind already dreading the answer. "No," Miller said, racking around into his sidearm, one-handed against his thigh. "We take the dish back, we plug their bleeding corpses into the transmission feed, and we broadcast it to whatever godforsaken fleet sent them. We show Snorts them exactly what happens when you kick a sleeping dog." The steel door behind them began to glow cherry red in the center. The hum was deafening now. The aliens were cutting their way in. The heat instantly turned the small bunker into a sweltering oven. Caleb hoisted the rotary cannon. It was heavy, primitive, and brutally effective. He looked at the glowing red steel, the fear in his chest hardening into a cold, jagged spike of pure malice. He was tired, he was freezing, he was hurting, and he was going to make them pay for every single second of it. Molten slag dripped from the center of the blast door, hitting the concrete floor with violent spitting hisses. A cherry-red circle rapidly expanded across the reinforced steel. Caleb squeezed the grips of the rotary cannon, his knuckles white. The weapon's metal was freezing, biting through his torn, blood-soaked gloves, while the ambient air in the bunker simultaneously baked his blistered face. Sweat stung his raw cheek. Every muscle in his lower back screamed un. Dare the 40 lb weight of the gun, he didn't feel like a super soldier. He felt like a terrified, exhausted kid holding an anvil he barely knew how to swing. A blinding beam of violet light punched cleanly through the center of the door, sweeping upward in a flawless arc. These creatures didn't batter obstacles down, they performed precision surgery on them. Miller didn't wait for the cut to finish. He kicked a high-explosive fragmentation grenade directly toward the glowing, weakening steel. Brace. Caleb threw himself sideways, dragging the cannon down with him. He clamped his hands over his ears and opened his mouth to save his eardrums. The explosion inside the enclosed concrete bunker was physically devastating. It wasn't a sound. It was a solid wall of pressure that punched the air out of Caleb's lungs and rattled his teeth in his skull. The blast door blew outward, warped and screaming, taking the alien breacher with it. "Move," Miller roared. The instructor didn't look back. He charged into the smoke, his sidearm barking in sharp, rhythmic cracks. Caleb scrambled up. His ears were ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the sleet storm outside. He hauled the rotary cannon to his hip and stumbled out of the bunker, stepping over a smoking, shattered chunk of iridescent alien armor. 3 invaders were waiting in the trench. They were recovering from the blast, their crystalline shields flickering as they tried to re-establish a defensive perimeter. They moved with that same maddening fluid grace, their weapons rising in terrifying unison. Caleb didn't aim. He just pointed the massive barrels forward and squeezed the firing stud. The recoil was a living, bucking animal attempting to tear his arms from their sockets. A deafening, continuous roar erupted from the cannon. It spat a solid stream of depleted uranium rounds, chewing the trench walls into flying shrapnel and mud. The vibration traveled up Caleb's arms, numbing his fingers instantly and rattling his vision into a blur. He couldn't hear himself screaming. The sheer volume of fire was absurd. The alien shields flared brilliant white for a fraction of a second before shattering entirely under the kinetic assault. The heavy rounds tore through their pristine armor like wet paper. Dark, viscous fluid sprayed across the corrugated plastil walls. One of the creatures was cut completely in half, its top torso collapsing into the freezing sludge while its legs twitched erratically. Caleb released the trigger. The barrel spun down with a high-pitched whir. A thick cloud of white smoke poured from the muzzle, smelling of sulfur and burnt grease. He was panting, his chest heaving, his forearms cramping so violently his fingers locked around the grips. "Clear," Becker croaked from behind him, stepping out of the bunker. Becker was clutching his relocated shoulder, his face pale and slick with rain, but he held a scavenged plasma rifle in his good hand. He looked at the mangled alien corpses and spat a wad of bloody saliva onto the nearest one. "Stupid bastards, don't admire your work," Miller snapped. He was already moving down the trench, his one arm constantly checking angles. "They communicate on a localized mesh network. The second one dies, the others know where it happened. We have exactly 2 minutes before they drop an orbital strike on this trench. Up the ridge." Caleb looked at the steep, muddy incline leading out of the trench system toward the primary communications dish. The dish sat on a rocky outcropping, a massive lattice of dark steel currently illuminated by the harsh blue glow of alien jamming equipment. It was 300 YD of open, slippery ground. "We're going to get slaughtered out there," Caleb said. It wasn't a complaint. It was a cynical statement of tactical fact. His legs felt like lead pipes. The 72 hours of sleep deprivation were clawing at the edges of his vision, creating ghostly afterimages in the sleet. "Then die running," Miller replied coldly. The instructor grabbed Caleb by the harness, yanking him forward. "You want to sleep, recruit? You can sleep when you're dead. Right now you owe me a radio tower." They scrambled over the lip of the trench. The wind hit them instantly, a freezing gale that stole the breath right out of Caleb's throat. The outpost was a graveyard. Fires burned in the craters where the barracks used to be, casting long, erratic shadows across the mud. In the distance, the staccato rhythm of human gunfire still popped, answering the searing hum of alien plasma. Other squads were still fighting. They were dying probably, but they were making the invaders bleed for every inch. Caleb leaned forward, digging his boots into the slick. He carried the heavy cannon across his chest, the sling cutting deeply into the back of his neck. His boots sank inches into the muck with every step, fighting a grotesque suction that threatened to pull his shoes off. Snorts a blue streak sizzled past his GHT ear, close enough that he smelled the sudden, sharp scent of ozone and singed rain. "Contact front," Becker yelled, dropping to his knees and firing a burst from his scavenged weapon. Caleb looked up through the driving sleet. At the top of the ridge, silhouetted against the bruised sky, 5 alien figures stood in perfect formation. They snorts were aiming down into the mud. They had the high ground. They had superior optics and they didn't look tired at all. Caleb's cynical heart sank, but his hand stubbornly, automatically leveled the rotary cannon. Gravity fought them for every agonizing inch. Sleet drove horizontally across the hillside, plastering Caleb's uniform to his bruised ribs. He was hauling 35 lb of dead metal now. The Snort's rotary cannon had jammed halfway up the slope when a casing ruptured in the feed chute, fusing the mechanism into a solid block of useless steel. He refused to drop it. In a twisted, irrational way, the heavy smoking weapon felt like an anchor tethering his fraying sanity to the physical world. "Keep moving," Miller barked from Caleb's left. The instructor was using a jagged piece of shrapnel as a makeshift cane, his cauterized stump wrapped tightly against his chest. He fired his sidearm blindly toward the crest. Above them, the 5 alien soldiers held their position. They weren't rushing. They were executing a textbook suppression strategy, firing precise, staggered bursts of plasma that chewed the mud into steaming, glass-lined craters. They were waiting for the humans to exhaust themselves, to slip, to simply give up. Caleb dove behind the rusted chassis of a destroyed mining excavator. Becker slid in right behind him, his breathing a ragged, wet sound that made Caleb's stomach turn. Becker's face was a mask of gray exhaustion, his eyes wide and completely unfocused. "I'm empty." Becker gasped, tossing the stolen plasma rifle into the dirt. The alien weapon hummed weakly, then went dark. The battery cell fused. "Caleb, I'm empty." Caleb pressed his back against the cold steel tread of the excavator. He drew Snorts his standard-issue combat knife from his chest rig. The blade was 7 in of blackened high-carbon steel. It looked pathetic compared to the iridescent humming weaponry raining down on them. "Then pick up a rock," Caleb hissed, his voice cracking. He didn't offer comfort. Comfort got you killed. "If they get to the dish, we all die. If we sit here, we die, so we go up." Miller slid into cover beside them, bleeding from a fresh plasma graze on his thigh. The smell of searing meat filled the cramped space behind the treads. Miller didn't even look at the wound. He looked at Caleb's jammed cannon, then at the knife in Caleb's hand. "They rely on thermal tracking in this weather," Miller rasped, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "Mud. Cover yourselves in the mud. Drop your core temperature." Caleb stared at the instructor. It was a suicide tactic. Submerging themselves in sub-zero sludge while already bordering on hypothermia was a death sentence. But so was the plasma raining down around them. Without a word, Caleb rolled onto his stomach and plunged his hands into the freezing, oily slush beneath the excavator. He smeared the thick gray paste over his face, packing it into his helmet, pushing it down the collar of his jacket. The cold was a physical shock, a violent jolt that caused his heart to stutter. His teeth began to chatter uncontrollably, biting his tongue. Becker followed suit, letting out a low, pathetic whimper as he packed mud over his injured shoulder. "On my mark," Miller whispered, his own face a mask of gray grime. "We break cover. We don't shoot until we are close enough to smell them." "Mark." They surged out from behind the rusted treads. The slope was steep, slick with ice and blood. Caleb scrambled on all fours like a feral animal, using his knife to carve handholds into the frozen earth. The sleet battered his eyes. The aliens at the top paused. Without the glaring thermal signatures of running humans, their targeting arrays hesitated for crucial seconds in the chaotic, debris-filled environment. Caleb closed the distance. 50 yards, 30 yards, 10. The lead alien finally registered the physical movement. It lowered its rifle, the wedge-shaped helmet tilting in abrupt realization. It was too late. Caleb didn't use martial arts. He didn't execute a clean tactical takedown. He launched his exhausted, freezing body directly at the creature's knees. They collided with a heavy, sickening crunch of armor against bone. Caleb felt his ribs flex dangerously as he tackled the alien into the slush. The creature was incredibly strong. It thrashed, throwing a backhand that caught Caleb in the helmet, shattering his visor and splitting his eyebrow open. Warm blood blinded his left eye. The alien raised its weapon, trying to point the barrel at Caleb's chest. Caleb drove his knife into the narrow gap between the chest plate and the shoulder join. He didn't thrust cleanly. He hammered the pommel with the heel of his hand, forcing the blade through the protective undersuit. The alien shrieked, that awful synthetic metallic sound, and dropped its rifle. Black fluid spewed over Caleb's hand, burning like mild acid. Caleb didn't stop. He ripped the knife out and plunged it into what passed for a throat, again and again. He was operating on pure, unadulterated lizard brain survival. He stabbed until his arm went numb, until the creature stopped twitching, until the black fluid stopped pumping. He rolled off the corpse, gasping, tasting iron and mud. To his right, Miller had closed the gap. The one-armed instructor had literally shoved his sidearm directly into the faceplate of an alien and pulled the trigger repeatedly, painting the mud with dark viscera. Becker was locked in a desperate grapple with a third. The alien was crushing Becker's throat. Caleb forced himself to his feet, his vision swimming with black spots. He took 3 staggering steps, raised his blood-slicked boot, and stomped the heel directly into the back of the alien's articulated knee joint. The joint snapped backward with a sound like a breaking tree branch. As the creature collapsed, Becker drove a scavenged steel tent peg straight into its visor. Silence fell over the ridge, broken only by the howling wind and the heavy, ragged breathing of 3 broken humans. Caleb looked up. The base of the primary communications dish loomed over them, a massive spire of human engineering. But wrapped around the primary transmission trunk was a parasitic, glowing piece of alien hardware. Its snorts pulsed with a sickening violet rhythm, locking out the terrestrial signals. They had made it to the top, but they were shattered, freezing to death. Snorts and Caleb had a distinct feeling the hardest part hadn't even begun. Violent purple light throbbed from the alien hardware, casting sickly, bruised shadows against the steel lattice of the primary comms dish. It didn't look entirely mechanical. The device wrapped around the main transmission trunk like a metallic tick, its segmented iridescent armor plating expanding and contracting with a wet, rhythmic hum. Every time it pulsed, Caleb felt a sharp, stabbing pressure behind his eyes. "Rip it off," Miller ordered, leaning heavily against the base of the tower. He was losing blood quickly, his snort's gray face taking on a waxy, translucent sheen. He pointed his sidearm down the ridge, his one good eye scanning the darkness. "Strip the parasite off the trunk." Caleb stared at the glowing mass. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely feel his own fingers. He wiped the mixture of freezing mud and black alien blood from his broken visor. "It's fused to the main line. If I tear it out, I might rip the fiber optic housing with it. We'll lose the array. If you don't tear it out, we lose the planet," Miller spat. The instructor fired 2 blind shots into the sleet. Down the slope, the distinct glass-shattering whine of alien weapons answered. More of them were climbing. They had realized their vanguard had been butchered and they were sending heavier units. The ground vibrated with the rhythmic, terrifying thud of mechanized footsteps. "Get up the ladder, recruit. Now." Caleb grabbed the rusted steel rungs of the maintenance ladder. The metal was sheer ice. He didn't climb with strength. He climbed with desperate, agonizing leverage, hooking his elbows over the rungs and hauling his dead weight upward. His ribs ground together, a sharp, white-hot agony that stole his breath. He reached the maintenance platform, 15 FT above the mud. Up close, the parasitic jammer smelled like burning ozone and rotten meat. Fine, hair-like metallic tendrils had burrowed deep into the human junction box, glowing with that same violent purple light. Caleb drew his combat knife. The blackened steel was already chipped and dull from grinding against alien bone. He wedged the blade between the parasite and the steel trunk and pushed. The device shrieked. It wasn't a mechanical alarm. It sounded like a living thing in pain. A surge of raw electrical feedback traveled down the knife blade, shocking Caleb's arm so hard his shoulder dislocated with a wet pop. He screamed, dropping the knife. It clattered against the grated floor and vanished into the darkness below. His right arm hung useless, completely numb. Down in the mud, Becker opened fire. The recruit was screaming, a high-pitched, wordless sound of pure terror, firing a scavenged alien rifle until the barrel glowed white-hot. Blue plasma illuminated the ridge. Caleb looked down and saw a massive silhouette cresting the hill. It was twice the size of the infantry units, a hulking, angular monstrosity armed with a shoulder-mounted cannon that hummed like a dying star. "Caleb!" Miller roared over the din of weapons fire. "Break it!" Caleb looked at his useless right arm, then at the pulsating purple tick. His cynical, exhausted brain abandoned all logic. There was no tactical solution left. There was only spite. He lunged forward, wrapping his left arm entirely around the searing hot, vibrating mass of the alien jammer. The heat instantly melted through his reinforced sleeve, fusing the synthetic nylon to his skin. The smell of his own roasting flesh hit the back of his throat, sweet and sickening. He clamped his jaw shut, tasting copper as his teeth cracked under the pressure, and threw his entire body weight backward off the platform. For a terrible, agonizing second, nothing happened. The metallic tendrils held fast. Caleb hung in the air, dangling by one blistering arm wrapped around a device that was trying to cook him alive. Then, with the sound of tearing metal and shattering glass, the human junction box gave way. Caleb plummeted backward, taking the parasite in a tangled nest of fiber optic cables with him. He hit the mud hard. All the air left his lungs in a violent rush. The purple light flared brilliantly, then sputtered and died, the hum fading into the howling wind. Above him, the ancient yellow warning lights of the human comms array flickered on, sluggish and dim, but undeniably alive. "I got it," Caleb wheezed to no one, his vision tunneling into a narrow, dark pipe. He tried to roll over, but his left arm was fused to the dead alien hardware, and his right arm wouldn't respond. Footsteps sloshed through the mud. Miller grabbed Caleb by his tactical harness and dragged him toward the concrete maintenance shack at the base of the tower. The instructor didn't say a word. He just hauled Caleb over the threshold, dropped him onto the grated floor, and turned to lay down suppressing fire. Becker backed into the shack a second later, dragging a severed alien helmet by its oxygen tubes. The recruit was bleeding freely from a shrapnel wound in his cheek, his eyes glazed and distant. Miller slammed the heavy steel door shut and threw the manual deadbolt. The walls of the shack immediately shuddered as heavy plasma fire hammered the exterior. "We have exactly 3 minutes before that heavy unit melts this bunker down to the foundation," Miller gasped, sliding his back down the door. He tossed the severed alien helmet to Becker. "Wire that into the terminal now." Static screamed through the maintenance shack's ancient overhead speaker, a beautiful snort's jagged sound of unblocked frequencies. Inside the cramped 10 by 10 concrete box, the air was a suffocating soup of copper, ozone, and the sour stench of terrified sweat. Becker knelt before the primary terminal, his hands shaking so badly he kept dropping the splicing pliers. He was trying to bridge the sleek biomechanical circuitry of the alien helmet with the thick copper wire guts of the terrestrial comms array. "It doesn't fit," Becker sobbed, his voice cracking. Tears cut clean tracks through the gray mud drying on his face. "Chief, the architecture is totally alien. There's no standardized port, it's just wetware and light." Miller pushed himself off the door. He swayed heavily, his skin gray. "Move." The instructor shoved Becker aside. With his single functioning hand, Miller didn't try to finesse the connection. He grabbed a handful of raw, stripped copper wires from the human terminal, jammed them directly into the gelatinous, glowing optic cluster at the base of the alien helmet, and Snort slammed a heavy lead-acid battery onto the clump to pin it down. The terminal screens flickered violently. Lines of harsh, jagged alien syntax bled across the green phosphor monitors, instantly battling with the clunky, blocky text of the human operating system. Sparks showered the floor. "They're interfacing," Miller grunted, his teeth bared in a feral grimace. He typed commands with one hand, his fingers flying across the greasy keyboard. "The parasitic network is trying to quarantine us, but their helmet is acting like a verified node. We're in their localized tactical net." A massive impact shook the shack, dust cascaded from the ceiling. Outside, the heavy alien unit was ramming the steel door, the metal shrieked, bowing inward slightly. "Send the distress signal," Caleb rasped from the floor. He was leaning against the wall, cradle holding his blistered left arm. "Tell Earth Command, tell the fleet." Miller stopped typing. He looked down at Caleb, his one good eye cold and utterly devoid of hope. "Command isn't coming, kid," Miller said softly. It was the quietest, most human tone Caleb had ever heard the man use. "We're 4 weeks away from the nearest fleet jump point. This outpost was meant to be a secret. Earth doesn't even acknowledge we exist on the official grid. If we call for help, we die before they launch a single rescue ship." The door buckled again, a seam split in the steel, letting in a sliver of blinding blue light and a gust of freezing wind. "Then what are we broadcasting?" Becker asked, his voice hollow. "Fear," Miller said. "Oh, he didn't." "Open a text editor." He didn't compose a heroic plea. Miller accessed the localized telemetry servers. The Vanguard training outpost was essentially a massive data collection machine designed to monitor the physical and psychological breaking points of its recruits. Every heartbeat, every drop of adrenaline, every microsecond of combat footage from the helmet cams was stored here. Miller grabbed all of it. Petabytes of raw, unedited, brutal data. He queued up the footage from a squad. Cole buried in the mud hacking a pristine alien soldier to pieces with a sharpened shovel. He queued up the biometric data of B's squad, showing human heart rates spiking into lethal zones, completely ignoring shock and fatigue, driven purely by spite and synthesized adrenaline. He queued up the live feed of Caleb tearing the parasite off the dish, his flesh burning, completely unbothered by self-preservation. They attacked us thinking we were soft, Miller typed rapidly, bundling the massive data package. They hit what they thought was a civilian mining colony to test our defenses. They wanted to see how easy humanity would break. The steel door finally ruptured. The hinges screamed as they sheared off the concrete. The heavy alien unit tore the door away, tossing it into the freezing rain. It stood in the doorway, a towering nightmare of iridescent armor and humming weaponry. Its faceless wedge helmet tilted downward, staring at the three broken, bleeding humans huddled in the glowing light of the ancient monitors. It raised its shoulder cannon. The inside of the barrel glowed with a terrifying, localized sun. "Send it," Caleb whispered. Miller hit the execute key. The primary comms dish above them hummed with sudden, terrifying power. It wasn't a tight beam transmission aimed at Earth. It was a massive, omnidirectional burst blasted directly back up the aliens' own localized mesh network, aimed straight at the fleet orbiting the planet. The data package tore through their pristine digital architecture like a virus. It didn't just show the aliens dying. It forced the alien command ships to process the raw, unfiltered biometric horror of what a human being becomes when pushed past the point of sanity. It showed them the Vanguard. It showed them that humanity didn't build super soldiers in labs. They forged them in the darkest, coldest mud they could find, starving them, breaking them, and teaching them to bite back. The heavy unit paused. A synthesized shriek erupted from its internal speakers as the data burst overloaded its tactical feed. For the first time, the creature took a physical step backward. Miller turned away from the terminal. He looked at Caleb and Becker, the bloody, feral smile returning to his face. "Class dismissed," Miller said. Data screamed through the localized mesh network, a digital contagion of pure, unadulterated human misery. The heavy alien unit staggered, its massive articulated legs locking up as the sheer volume of Vanguard telemetry flooded its neural-linked processor. It didn't compute. A species that required sterile battlefields, perfect geometric formations, and absolute tactical superiority was suddenly downloading the raw, unedited sensation of a human recruit chewing through an alien jugular with his bare teeth just because his shovel broke. Sparks cascaded from the creature's eyeless wedge helmet. The sickening purple glow of its internal systems flickered wildly, transitioning into an alarmed, strobing amber. Its shoulder cannon whined, the localized sun inside the barrel shifting from blinding white to a dying, unstable yellow. It wasn't aiming at Caleb anymore. The weapon jerked toward the ceiling, then the floor, twitching like a malfunctioning drone fighting its own targeting subroutines. The alien was experiencing a localized catastrophic panic. Miller didn't waste the hesitation. The instructor's face was entirely drained of color, his breathing nothing more than a wet, ragged rattle in his chest. He turned his back on the hulking monster, grabbed Caleb by his tactical harness with his remaining hand, and violently shoved him toward the shattered doorway. "Get out," Miller choked out, kicking Becker in the ribs to get him moving. "Get down the ridge now." Caleb stumbled backward into the driving sleet, his boots slipping on the bloody grated floor. "Chief, we can't," I said. "Class dismissed. Recruit," Miller roared, a terrifying, bloody sound that tore his remaining vocal cords. Becker grabbed Caleb's belt, dragging him out into the mud. They tumbled over the threshold just as the alien shoulder cannon misfired. The blast didn't hit them. It hit the main snort support beam of the concrete maintenance shack. The structure groaned, a deep structural death rattle. Caleb scrambled backward on his stomach, sliding down the freezing, slick mud of the ridge. Through the driving rain, he looked back at the ruined doorway. Miller was standing exactly where they had left him, silhouetted. By the erratic amber light of the malfunctioning alien, the instructor wasn't looking at the creature. He was looking at the human terminal, making absolutely sure the upload reached 100%. The shack collapsed. Hundreds of tons of reinforced concrete and rusted steel folded inward, instantly crushing the terminal, the heavy alien unit, and Chief Miller into a flattened, smoking tomb. A shockwave of displaced mud and pulverized concrete hit Caleb and Becker, throwing them further down the slope. They tumbled head over heels, a violent bone-breaking descent through the razor wire and debris until snorts they slammed into the flooded bottom of the primary communication trench. Freezing water filled Caleb's mouth. He choked, spitting up a mixture of mud, diesel fuel, and his own blood. He tried to push himself up, but his left arm was completely fused to his side. The burns a localized epicenter of white-hot agony. His right shoulder was still dislocated, hanging uselessly. He managed to roll onto his back, kicking his legs until his head rested against the corrugated plastoid wall of the trench. He waited for the sky to fall. He waited for the orbital bombardment that standard tactical doctrine dictated. If you lose an engagement, you sanitize the grid. That was the rule. Minutes ticked by, measured only by the rattling, ragged breathing of Becker lying a few feet away. The orbital strike never came. Instead, a deep resonant hum vibrated through the crust of the planet. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of alien drop pods descending. It was the heavy atmospheric tearing of massive thrusters engaging in reverse. Caleb forced his eyes open, blinking away the stinging sleet. Through the bruised purple canopy of methane clouds, brilliant streaks of blue light were ascending. Dozens of them, then hundreds. The alien drop ships were abandoning the outpost. They weren't retreating in a coordinated tactical withdrawal. They were fleeing. The trajectories were erratic, panicked, as if every pilot in the fleet was desperately fighting to put as much distance as possible between their sterile ships and this miserable toxic rock. The invaders had looked at the biometric data. They had processed the sheer terrifying malice of an exhausted human being with a broken rifle and a rock snorts, and decided that whatever resources this planet held, they simply weren't worth the nightmare of trying to pacify it. Silence slowly reclaimed Outpost 9. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the heavy ringing quiet of a graveyard broken only by the wind howling across the craters and the hiss of rain hitting molten slag. Down the trench, a shape shifted in the mud. A massive blood-soaked figure hauled itself to its feet, leaning heavily on a shattered piece of plasteel. It was Cole from a squad. Half his face was coated in that viscous black alien blood and his body armor was shredded to ribbons. He looked around the ruined compound, then looked up at the retreating blue streaks in the sky. He didn't cheer. He didn't raise his weapon in victory. He just let out a long, exhausted sigh and slumped against the trench wall, sliding down into the muck. Further out, more shapes began to emerge from the wreckage, recruits dragging themselves out of craters, pulling wounded squadmates from under burning transports. They looked like ghosts, hollowed out and completely drained of whatever humanity they had brought with them to this rock. Becker let out a weak coughing laugh. It sounded like a dog choking on a bone. "We passed the final drill," he whispered, staring blankly at the sky. Caleb let his head fall back against the cold steel. The cynical reality of their situation settled into his bones heavier than the exhaustion. Command was gone, the instructors were dead, the outpost was a smoldering crater, but the Vanguard network was still active. Earth Command would eventually see the transmission. They would see what their recruits had done. They wouldn't send medals. They wouldn't send a rescue fleet to bring them home to a hero's welcome. They would send more dropships, rebuild the mess hall, and make them do it all over again because they had proven the crucible worked. "Yeah," Caleb muttered, his eyes closing as the freezing rain washed the ash from his blistered face. "But if Command thinks they're getting me out of this trench without a hot shower first, they can go to hell. There you have it." The gritty, brutal reality of human resilience when pushed past the absolute brink. That's how Earth's most miserable, exhausted recruits broke a flawless alien invasion without a single functioning warship, armed with nothing but spite and a broken shovel. If this raw dive into HFY Sci-Fi got your blood pumping, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Drop a comment below and tell me what you would do if you were stuck in the mud of Outpost 9. Share this video with anyone who loves their sci-fi dark and grounded and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Until next time, keep your rifles loaded and stay in the mud.